Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight, what we are witnessing is not just another battlefield update. It is a turning point in a war that refuses to fade from the world's conscience. A war that began with aggression and tonight may very well have ignited a fire of reckoning across Russia's own borders. Because when Moscow, the heart of Russian power, goes dark, the world takes notice. What we are witnessing now is a shift not just in tactics, but in the very geography of consequence. For nearly 3 years, Russia's war on Ukraine has played out as a one-way theater of destruction. Missiles raining down on cities, power plants destroyed, hospitals turned to rubble, and civilians forced to live beneath the haunting hum of air raid sirens. But now that narrative has cracked. The illusion that this war could be contained neatly boxed within Ukrainian borders while Moscow remained untouched has finally been shattered. Ukraine's latest operation, led by the now famous Flamingo drone, didn't just pierce Russian airspace. It pierced the myth that Russia's aggression would never find its way home. Think about that. For months, the Kremlin has acted as if it could wage war without consequence, as if the flames it ignited would never blow back across its own borders. The world watched Russian leaders boast of special operations while the rest of us saw the images: schools obliterated, hospitals without power, mothers carrying children through smoke-filled streets. The Kremlin wanted to project strength, but tonight, as Moscow sits cloaked in darkness, that strength looks a lot like fragility. The power grid failures, the emergency sirens, the confusion in the capital, it's all symbolic of something larger. The war has come home, and this right here is where history shifts, because when a capital that has long claimed dominance suddenly feels the sting of its own aggression, something fundamental changes. This is not about revenge, it's about reality. Ukraine has effectively said, if you can reach into our homes, we can reach into yours. It's not a boast, it's not even a threat. It's a statement of balance, a reminder that no empire, no matter how powerful, can light the world on fire and expect to remain unscathed. Here's the uncomfortable truth for Moscow's elite. The war they started has finally stopped being abstract. It's no longer just happening over there across the border, where propaganda paints Ukrainians as the enemy. Now, for the first time, Russia's attack on civilians explained ordinary Russians are tasting that same uncertainty, that same vulnerability that Ukrainians have lived with every single day since 2022. The fear that when you wake up tomorrow the lights might not come on, the fear that the sky above your city might not be safe anymore, and that fear that's powerful because once people start feeling the war in their own skin, they begin to ask questions. Questions that dictators despise. Why are we here? What are we fighting for? How long will we be kept in the dark, literally and figuratively? Those questions are the beginning of change. Ukraine's strike did not aim to level Moscow. It aimed to illuminate the truth that power, no matter how vast, has limits. That bullying your neighbor eventually brings the fight to your doorstep. And that the era of impunity where Russia could strike without fear of reprisal may be over. It's almost poetic, isn't it? A drone named Flamingo, delicate, graceful, almost peaceful by name, soaring across the border, carrying a message louder than any explosion. You cannot control the world with fear forever. The symbolism is extraordinary. A bird of light plunging a superpower's capital into darkness. That's not just an act of war. That's an act of revelation, and for the rest of the world watching, this is a wake-up call. The boundaries between aggressor and victim are shifting. The balance of power, once tilted so heavily toward the Kremlin, is beginning to wobble. The myth of Russian invincibility, so carefully crafted through propaganda, is unraveling under the weight of reality. So tonight, when we say the war has crossed the line of containment, it's not just about geography, it's about accountability. Ukraine didn't expand the war. Russia did long ago when it decided that civilian lives were expendable. Ukraine's response was inevitable, even measured given the scale of suffering it has endured. The war has crossed the line of containment because the truth has crossed it too. The truth that aggression invites consequence, that oppression breeds resistance, and that the darkness Moscow faces tonight isn't just from a damaged power grid. It's from the reflection of its own actions finally flickering back across its sky. That's the new reality. The war is no longer over there. It's everywhere Russia chooses to deny it exists. And now the question is not whether the world will respond. It's whether Moscow will finally wake up to the storm it created. There's a misconception spreading fast that Ukraine's strike on Moscow was an act of revenge, a reckless display of anger. But that assumption misses the entire point. What happened wasn't rage, it was strategy. Every detail of the Flamingo operation was calculated, deliberate, and executed with surgical precision. This wasn't chaos unleashed. This was message delivered. Ukraine didn't lash out. Ukraine spoke, and the language it used was power, technology, and restraint. From the outside, it may look like another drone strike in a long list of military maneuvers. But if you look closer, you see a deeper intelligence at play. The target wasn't random. It wasn't designed to inflict maximum physical damage or mass casualties. Instead, it was chosen for its psychological weight. Ukraine aimed at Russia's confidence, the illusion of invulnerability that Moscow has used as a weapon since the first day of this war. And with one strike, they dismantled it. When the lights went out in Moscow, the message couldn't have been clearer. You are not untouchable. That's the genius of strategy. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers and the world listens. The Flamingo wasn't a roar of vengeance. It Ukraine's Flamingo drone. The turning point was a quiet, controlled reminder that the same fear, uncertainty, and disruption that Russia inflicted on Ukrainian civilians could now echo within its own capital. It was a mirror held up to power, and in that reflection, Russia saw its own aggression staring back. Let's be honest, war isn't just fought with missiles and tanks anymore. It's fought with perception, with control over narrative, with the ability to shape how people feel about what's happening. Russia has relied on that psychological advantage since the beginning. The Kremlin wanted to make Ukrainians feel small, powerless, afraid. But the Flamingo turned that strategy on its head. Suddenly, it's Moscow that's feeling exposed, vulnerable, and deeply aware that its defenses are not as ironclad as it claims. That shift from physical dominance to psychological disruption is where the brilliance lies. Ukraine knew that raw destruction wouldn't change the game, but strategic disruption would. Knocking out electricity in the Russian capital for just a few hours did more to challenge the Kremlin's authority than a 100 battlefield skirmishes. Because power, both literal and political, thrives on the illusion of control, and when the lights flickered out, so did that illusion. Think about it. No government wants to admit that it can't protect its capital. No leader who built their image on strength wants to show weakness at home, and yet the Flamingo forced that moment of vulnerability. For the first time, the Russian people saw that their government, the same one that claims to defend them from foreign threats, couldn't even keep their own skies safe. That's not just a tactical hit. That's a narrative collapse, and here's the hook that makes it even more striking. Ukraine didn't brag. There was no triumphant parade, no boastful speech, just quiet confirmation, subtle pride, and a strong moral stance. We did what we had to do. That silence spoke louder than any declaration of victory ever could, because true strategy doesn't need noise. It needs precision, timing, and purpose, and Ukraine showed all three. What many don't realize is that strategy is not just about where you hit. It's about why and how you hit. The Flamingo operation demonstrated mastery of both. It wasn't aimed at punishing civilians. It was aimed at exposing hypocrisy. It wasn't a symbol of chaos. It was a symbol of order in the face of lawlessness. Ukraine's leadership knew that the world was watching, and they understood that every move, every drone, every spark in that night sky would be judged not just militarily, but morally. By choosing restraint over rage, Ukraine sent a message that resonates far beyond borders. We are not you. We can defend ourselves without becoming what we fight against. That's not just strategy, that's integrity. And in the world of modern politics and warfare, integrity is a far rarer weapon than firepower. When Rachel Maddow would speak about moments like this, she'd lean in and remind her viewers of something simple but profound. In war, the smartest move is not always the loudest. It's the one that changes how your opponent thinks, how they perceive themselves. That's what happened in Moscow that night. The Flamingo wasn't a declaration of escalation. It was a demonstration of intelligence. The irony is sharp. Russia, the country that prides itself on controlling every narrative, just lost control of the one that matters most, the narrative of power. And all it took was a single strategic, elegant move from a nation it tried to crush. That's not chaos, that's clarity. That's not retaliation, that's precision. And that precision may be the first sign that the tide of this war is no longer being measured in explosions, but in the power of calculated restraint. For months, the images have been haunting smoldering hospitals, shattered schools, children wrapped in blankets inside makeshift shelters. Russia's war machine has made civilians the front line, the innocent, the unarmed, the ordinary. They have paid the highest price for a conflict they never chose, and yet somehow Moscow continues to justify it all with the same tired rhetoric. Military targets, strategic necessity, national defense. But here's the truth that can no longer be hidden. The attacks on civilians have become Russia's greatest weakness, not its strength. The very thing it uses to project dominance has turned into the most powerful evidence of its moral collapse. Every missile that lands in a residential block, every drone that hits a hospital, every scream that echoes through a once peaceful neighborhood chips away at the Kremlin's mask of legitimacy. You cannot bomb playgrounds and still claim to be a liberator. You cannot destroy maternity wards and still pretend you are fighting for justice. The moment Moscow lost power, and tonight, as parts of Moscow go dark, that truth is finally catching up to the empire that has tried so hard to bury it beneath propaganda. It's important to understand this. In modern warfare, image is everything. Winning hearts and minds is just as vital as winning territory. Russia's relentless targeting of civilians has done something no foreign military could achieve. It has united the world against it. Each attack designed to crush Ukrainian morale has instead hardened it. Each act of brutality meant to terrify has inspired defiance. Every child who survives a bombing becomes living proof that courage can outlast cruelty. Here's the hook that makes this moment so powerful. For the first time, Russia's cruelty isn't just shocking the world, it's haunting its own people. As news of Ukraine's Flamingo strikes spread, Russians found themselves asking uncomfortable questions. Why are we under attack? Why is our capital suddenly vulnerable? Why are we paying the price for a war we were told was about protection? Those questions are dangerous for any regime built on lies, because once you start questioning the story loses power. And that's the irony of Russia's strategy. The more it tries to dominate through fear, the more it exposes its own fragility. Every bomb dropped on civilians doesn't just destroy buildings, it erodes credibility. It isolates the country further. It turns allies into skeptics and citizens into cynics. The more innocent blood spilled, the less the world is willing to listen to Moscow's justifications. The global community has seen too many mass graves, too many orphaned families, too many cities reduced to rubble. Sympathy has hardened into outrage, And outrage is a force even missiles cannot silence. There's also a psychological dimension to this, and it's devastating for Russia. When you rely on terror as a tactic, you reveal something fundamental, that you no longer believe in your own strength. True power doesn't need to target the weak. Only the desperate do that. The Kremlin's decision to attack civilians wasn't born from confidence. It was born from fear, fear of losing control, fear of a people who refused to bow, fear of a nation that keeps fighting back no matter the cost. And that's where the Flamingo comes in, not as revenge, but as reflection. Ukraine didn't respond to those civilian massacres with the same cruelty. It responded with strategy, precision instead of chaos, symbolism instead of slaughter. It demonstrated what moral high ground looks like in the middle of darkness. The message couldn't be clearer. We don't need to kill innocents to prove our strength. We don't need to match your cruelty to defeat your arrogance. The world saw that difference, and it matters, because in every conflict, there comes a moment when the global narrative shifts from who's winning to who's right. And Russia, through its relentless assault on civilians, has already lost that question. The war crimes committed in Mariupol, Khark, they're not just historical stains. They're active evidence that the Kremlin no longer fights for victory, but for survival. When Rachel Maddow would dissect this on air, she'd do it with a calm intensity, connecting the dots that others overlook. She'd remind us that moral authority is as powerful as military might, and right now, Ukraine holds both. Because while Russia bombs apartment blocks, Ukraine builds alliances. While Russia spreads fear, Ukraine spreads truth. And while Russia hides behind propaganda, Ukraine fights in the open with dignity, transparency, and unbroken spirit. And here's the most haunting twist. Those same civilians Russia tried to break have become the foundation of Ukraine's resistance. The teachers, doctors, mothers, and students who lost everything are now the moral backbone of a nation refusing to die quietly. The Kremlin thought civilian suffering would end the fight. Instead, it fueled it. That's the paradox of cruelty. It always underestimates the strength of the human heart. So, as Moscow sits in literal darkness tonight, perhaps it should look toward the very people it tried to destroy to understand what resilience really means. Because in this war, power is no longer measured by how many missiles you can launch. It's measured by how many people still stand after you've launched them. And Ukraine, despite all the devastation, is still standing stronger, prouder, and more united than ever. There are moments in history when symbolism becomes more powerful than any weapon. When an act speaks louder than an entire arsenal, the Ukrainian Flamingo drone strike was one of those moments. It wasn't just a military maneuver. It was art in motion. Rachel Maddow's analysis, what this means for Putin in a statement written in fire and silence. Because sometimes in the theater of war, it's not about how big the explosion is, but what it represents. And this one represented everything Russia didn't want the world to see: vulnerability, exposure, and the crumbling illusion of control. From the name alone, the operation was almost poetic. Flamingo, a bird of grace and balance, not aggression. It carries the image of elegance, of beauty, standing tall even in muddy waters, and that's exactly what Ukraine communicated. A symbol of defiance that didn't roar, it glided. It flew over borders, over propaganda, over the noise of war, and it delivered a message no broadcast could silence. The oppressed still have wings. The aggressor can be touched. The empire can be shaken. In modern conflict, symbolism is strategy. Every move is designed not just to wound the enemy physically, but to fracture their image, their narrative, their confidence. The Flamingo's flight across Russian airspace didn't simply show military capability. It showed creativity. It showed that Ukraine's greatest weapon isn't just technology, its imagination. In a world where Russia relies on brute force and intimidation, Ukraine chose precision, grace, and symbolism. That's not just warfare, that's storytelling. And Ukraine told the world a story of strength that transcends missiles and machinery. When the first reports broke of explosions near Moscow, Russian media scrambled to contain the narrative. They wanted to downplay it, to treat it as an accident, to bury the fear. But fear doesn't stay buried when the capital of a superpower trembles. The image of Moscow in partial darkness, even if temporary, was enough to ignite the imagination of millions. People didn't see a drone strike. They saw justice. They saw irony. They saw the moment when power blinked. That's what makes this so much more than a military victory. It's a psychological one. There's a profound hook here. In every act of war, there are layers of meaning, and Ukraine, knowingly or not, tapped into one of the oldest truths in human conflict. Symbols outlast soldiers, armies fall, borders shift, but symbols remain. The image of a drone named Flamingo diving through the sky toward the heart of Moscow will live longer than any battlefield statistic. It's the kind of moment historians will study, not for its damage, but for its message. Russia's leadership has spent years constructing an image of invincibility. The Kremlin's propaganda machine has painted the war as something distant, righteous, and inevitable. But you can't control perception when your own citizens watch their skyline light up with fire. The symbolism of that night shattered the illusion of distance. It made the war personal for Russians in a way no speech or state-controlled news segment ever could. Suddenly, they weren't just hearing about conflict. They were feeling it. That's what power looks like when it's turned inside out. And what makes this even more compelling is how deliberately Ukraine used restraint. They didn't flatten Moscow. They didn't turn the city into rubble. That's not who they are. The flamingo didn't symbolize destruction. It symbolized awareness, a tap on the shoulder of an empire saying you are not beyond consequence. That's a message with precision and purpose. The kind of message that echoes louder than bombs. Rachel Maddow would say this is where politics meets poetry, the point where strategy becomes a story and truth becomes a spectacle. The brilliance of the Flamingo strike lies not in its scale, but in its subtlety. It forced the world to look again at a war many had begun to tune out. It reminded audiences across continents that Ukraine is not just surviving. It's evolving, adapting, creating. It's showing that intelligence, innovation, and courage can still bend the will of even the most oppressive regimes. Symbols like this change public opinion. They alter how allies think, how enemies respond, and how citizens perceive their governments. The flamingo has become more than a drone. It's a metaphor for every nation, every person who refuses to stay silent in the face of oppression. It's the embodiment of resistance with dignity, global reaction, and Western response in a war defined by brutality. The flamingo offered something unexpected elegance, not the elegance of peace, but the elegance of purpose. It reminded the world that strength doesn't have to scream. Sometimes it flies quietly through the night, delivering a truth that burns brighter than any bomb, and that truth is this: symbolism, when wielded with intention, can make even the mightiest fortress feel fragile. It can turn fear back toward its maker. It can make darkness feel like justice, because in the end, the flamingo didn't just strike a grid. It illuminated a truth the world needed to see. Power without conscience is hollow. And symbolism, when born from courage, can pierce even the darkest sky. When the lights in Moscow went out, the world didn't just see a blackout. It saw the collapse of an illusion. The city that once stood as the unshakable heart of Russian might suddenly look fragile, uncertain, even fearful. And that single moment of darkness became more symbolic than any battlefield victory. For years, the Kremlin has projected power through the image of invulnerability, the shining lights of the capital, the carefully curated confidence, the endless speeches about strength. But when that light flickered out, even for a moment, the world saw something different. The face of a superpower realizing it is no longer untouchable. It's easy to dismiss a temporary power outage as minor in the context of war. But the truth is, it wasn't the electricity that failed. It was the illusion of control. In politics, perception is power, and for Russia, that perception has been everything. The Kremlin's dominance is built not only on military force, but on psychological authority. The belief that it cannot be shaken, that it is too vast, too strong, too insulated to feel the consequences of its own aggression. And yet, on that night, as Ukraine's Flamingo drones soared through the sky, it ripped that narrative apart. Here's the hook that no one can ignore. When people who have been told they are safe begin to feel fear, everything changes. Russians who watched the skyline of their capital flicker with explosions weren't just watching news from the front. They were watching their own vulnerability unfold. That's not a military loss. That's a psychological revolution. The same fear that has haunted Ukrainians for nearly 3 years now echoed through Moscow streets. For the first time, Russians experienced what it means to live under the shadow of uncertainty. And that is something no government propaganda can fully silence. The blackout in Moscow became a mirror reflecting the truth that the Kremlin has long refused to face. For all its military boasting, for all its talk of sovereignty and power, Russia is not immune to consequence. The very strategy it used to intimidate Ukraine, the attacks on infrastructure, the deliberate targeting of civilian energy systems has now returned home. It's poetic justice, yes, but it's also a geopolitical shift. Because when a nation that claims dominance is forced to confront its own fragility, its narrative begins to unravel from within. Rachel Maddow would frame it perfectly. This isn't about a drone strike. It's about a psychological recalibration of power. The light in Moscow didn't just go out physically, it went out metaphorically, too. The blackout became a symbol of exposure. A moment when citizens began to realize that the war their government called special isn't distant anymore. It's here, it's real, inside Ukraine's message to the world, and it's changing everything. This is what makes the Flamingo operation so brilliant in its subtlety. Ukraine didn't need to destroy Moscow. It only needed to disturb its comfort. It didn't need to bring devastation. It only needed to bring awareness. For years, Russians could watch this war on television and believe it was happening somewhere else to someone else. But when your street goes dark, when the hum of the city stops, and when you realize that safety is not guaranteed, you start to think differently. You start to ask questions. And those questions are dangerous not for the people, but for the regime. When ordinary Russians begin to wonder why their country is under attack, why their soldiers are dying, why their economy is breaking, why their homes are no longer safe, that's when the power structure begins to crack. Because propaganda can hide the truth, but it can't hide fear. Fear is personal. Fear turns obedience into doubt, and doubt is contagious. The Moscow blackout, brief as it was, represents the beginning of that doubt. It's the first time the Russian people have felt even a fraction of the anxiety that Ukrainians live with daily. And once that empathy begins, once that human connection to suffering forms, no government can fully erase it. You can censor television broadcasts. You can arrest protesters. But you cannot control what people feel when they are sitting in the dark wondering if the next sound they hear will be the echo of another strike. What makes this moment so profound is how it redefines what power means. True power isn't about suppressing others. It's about stability, credibility, and respect. And Moscow's blackout stripped all three away in a single night. The world saw it and more. Importantly, Russians felt it. The psychological fortress that Putin's regime spent decades constructing showed its first cracks, and those cracks will only widen. Because here's the truth. Light can always be restored, but innocence cannot. Once people have felt the fragility of their own safety, they never see their government the same way again. Ukraine's message wasn't one of destruction. It was a revelation, a reminder that no one, not even the most powerful, can escape the consequences of their choices. So when the lights went out in Moscow, it wasn't just an interruption of power. It was a moment of reckoning, a whisper in the darkness that said, "The war you started has finally found its way home." When the world goes quiet, when the headlines fade, and the bombs stop echoing for a brief moment, what remains is a truth that cannot be buried. Freedom fights back. You can suppress a people, you can occupy their land, but you can never own their will to resist. Ukraine's answer to oppression has not only been through battlefields and front lines, but through spirit, strategy, and defiance. The moment their Flamingo drone lit up the Moscow sky, it was not just a tactical retaliation. It was a declaration. It said to the world, "We will not just survive, we will rise." And that's the kind of power that terrifies tyrants. Because power doesn't just come from weapons or armies. It comes from conviction. It comes from the unshakable belief that freedom is worth any price. For years, Russia believed it could dictate the narrative, that fear could silence truth, that propaganda could rewrite reality. But you cannot bomb truth into silence. You cannot jail freedom. And that's exactly what this moment revealed. The oppressed have found their voice, and that voice echoes far louder than any missile ever could. This war, as brutal as it has been, has hope in the darkness. The human side of war exposed something extraordinary. Ukraine has become the world's frontline defender of democracy, not by choice, but by necessity. And as the world watched the lights in Moscow flicker out, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. For the first time, the aggressor felt the tremor of vulnerability. The hunter realized it could be hunted. That's not just a tactical victory, that's a psychological revolution. Because when a nation refuses to bow, refuses to break, it inspires others to stand taller too. Freedom has a way of finding its way back into the light. And that's the story that history will remember. Not the tanks, not the terror, but the courage of ordinary people who said enough. This was not just Ukraine's message to Russia. It was a message to the entire world. Every dictatorship watching, every autocrat plotting, every regime built on control, they all heard it loud and clear. Freedom doesn't beg, it fights back. There's something deeply human about that. You can strip away borders, flags, and politics. And what remains is a universal truth. No one wants to live on their knees, and when pushed too far, people rise. The flamingo was not just a weapon. It was a metaphor, a symbol of beauty transformed into resilience. It soared into enemy skies, not for destruction, but for dignity. It carried with it the message that even in darkness, light can strike back. And that's what makes this so powerful. Because in the grand theater of geopolitics, we often forget the human heart behind it all. The mother who tucks her child into bed in a bomb shelter, the soldier who fights not for conquest but for home, the journalist who risks her life to tell the truth. These are the real warriors of freedom, and the ones who remind us that courage doesn't always come with medals. Sometimes it comes with silence, with endurance, with the refusal to give up. When Ukraine struck back, it wasn't just about defending borders. It was about defending belief. The belief that tyranny is temporary, but truth is eternal. The belief that you can destroy a city, but not its spirit. And that belief now burns across the world, igniting hearts that had gone numb, reminding nations that freedom must be closing. Freedom fights back protected, not assumed. So when the world saw that flash of light over Moscow, it wasn't just an explosion. It was a signal, a reminder that even the smallest nation, when united by purpose, can shake the foundations of power. It was the kind of moment that rewrites history, that forces us to choose sides, not between countries, but between courage and fear. Freedom doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't ask politely. It moves through walls, through fear, through fire. And tonight, it moves through Ukraine, through every drone that flies, every siren that wails, every heartbeat that refuses to surrender. The world is watching and history is recording. Freedom is not losing, it's fighting back. And this time, it's not just fighting for Ukraine, it's fighting for all of us. And as Moscow sits in temporary darkness tonight, perhaps, just perhaps, the Kremlin might finally understand what it means to live without light, without justice, without peace. But if there's one thing we've learned through this brutal conflict, it's this. You can dim the lights, but you can't dim the truth. You can destroy buildings, but not the spirit of those who rebuild them. And you can silence voices, but not the will of a nation that refuses to die quietly. Ukraine's Flamingo did not just strike a power grid. It struck fear into the heart of tyranny, and maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of darkness Russia needs to finally see,